Welcome to Burris Agronomy U. This is our fourth part of a series on sulfur, a series that we've been doing for a while now. We're venturing into the topic of plant available sources. We had session 1, session 2, session 3A, and session 3B before this. And now we're going to talk about where we are in the overall theme and the overall outline for this series. We started this series in session 1 by covering the basic information about sulfur. How does the plant use sulfur? What is it used for? We talked about the series theme, and we talked about how sulfur enters into the soil sulfur cycle, how it enters in through atmospheric deposition or the application of fertilizer. Then we went on in session 2 and we talked about plant availability. We talked about the plant drawing in sulfate, a negatively charged molecule, as the primary source of sulfur. We went on in sessions 3A and 3B to talk about major plant available sources of sulfur. So we talked about organic material. We said that's the major source. We talked about atmospheric deposition, and we again talked about fertilizer. Today, we're going to go on and talk about minor plant available sources of sulfur. So not the major, the big three that we talked about earlier, but some sources within the soil that maybe don't constitute the major source, but they do still supply a little sulfur to the plant. This has been our theme throughout the series. Always look to the cycle. We've talked about this before. We've said that many of the questions we have can be answered by simply looking at the soil sulfur cycle, and that's what we intend to do. This was that really complicated sulfur cycle, soil sulfur cycle that we talked about at the beginning of our series. And we gave a pep talk at that time, and we'll give it again, just mentioning that you should not get too worked up about how complex this cycle seems. It is complex, but we said we were going to break it into pieces, and that is what we've been doing. So I'd encourage you, if you haven't had a chance to see sessions 1, 2, 3A, and 3B, go back and do that now. Go back and do that now, and it'll help you follow some things that we're going to cover later on in upcoming series. This is one of those points that we have stressed throughout this series. We've said that plants primarily take up sulfur as sulfate, that negatively charged molecule that's taken up by the water stream. And so however we're going to supply sulfur to the plant, whatever source we look at, we want it to eventually get to sulfate so that it can be taken up by the plant. This is the conversation we had regarding those major sources of sulfur. Remember, we said there's overall 5 sources of sulfur to the plant in the soil, but we said there are 3 major ones. And we said organic material, once again, was one of the big ones. We said after that comes atmospheric deposition. And then we talked about sulfur fertilizers as being a third source, the third most important source of sulfur for the plant. Now, when we get done talking about the 3 major sources, we said there are 5 sources of sulfur for the plant. But we said there are 3 major ones. These are our 2 minor sources, mineral sources and adsorbed sources of sulfur. Now, flipping back to that sulfur cycle, the soil sulfur cycle, you can see where these 2 minor sources of sulfur can be found in that overall process. You can see mineral sulfur there, and you can see adsorbed sulfur once again. Adsorbed sources of sulfur are really things like coatings on soil particles. So we have sulfur rapidly react with other things in the soil, or at least react with other things in the soil, and it becomes a coating on the soil particle. Only a portion of this adsorbed sulfur is actually released into the soil for the plant to use. Now, that said, if you look at its proximity to sulfate in this graph, you can see that absorbed sulfur would be a little bit more plant available than maybe the other source of sulfur that we're going to talk about now. So that other source of sulfur is mineral. So mineral sources of sulfur represent a second, very minor source of sulfur for the plant. And this makes sense because we're talking about minerals, rock-like material, right, that needs to weather away, that needs to slowly break down to release that sulfur within. And you can imagine that this really constitutes a much longer process, and not quite so rapid process. There are several different sources, mineral sources of sulfur. You can see gypsum, which we grind down into fine powders that can then react more rapidly in the soil, and we use that as a primary source of sulfur fertilizer oftentimes. And then pyrite is another one, as well as some other examples right here. And I want you to think about what I just got done saying. I said that gypsum can be a mineral, a naturally occurring source, a mineral source, a minor source of sulfur in the soil. But I also said that gypsum can be a fertilizer, which is a major source of sulfur for the plant. Now, how can it be both? The reason it can be both is we basically grind that stuff down. Remember earlier, and like we said just a second ago, we grind that stuff down, but remember in an earlier lesson we talked about fineness of grind, creating the possibility for materials to react rapidly in the soil. Well, when we grind gypsum down, we basically rapidly take it through a process that naturally occurs very slowly. So we have these small particle sizes that can release that material into the soil. That's why it can be a fertilizer source and a source that rapidly corrects deficiencies. Now, on its own, that weathering process is very slow. So again, for all these materials, all these mineral sources of sulfur, to become plant available, they have to go through this very, very slow weathering process. We speed that up with sulfur fertilizers and get small particle sizes, but to have that happen naturally takes a long, long time. And eventually, after that long, long process of sloughing off that mineral, we wind up with some sulfate that can be available to the plant. Now, again, to be fair, sometimes when we're talking about gypsum, we're talking about material that's actually created through other things being produced, so as a byproduct, for instance. And we probably need to lay that out there. And that also explains why some of the gypsum sources that we use are rapidly available for plant uptake, as opposed to some of those mineral sources of gypsum taking a while to weather down. But let's just talk one more time about weathering. Weathering typically releases sulfate sulfur into the soil, but it does so, as we said, once again, very slowly. And that's one of the reasons why this is a pretty slow process of release. Not only do we have, in some cases, this weathering process take a little while, some of those sources we mentioned are also going to have to be converted over to sulfate for the plant to take up. Now, I really would not be right if I did not continue on and talk about this point. And while we have talked about ways that sulfur can be drawn into the plant through the soil profile, there is one other very minor, more minor source of plant available sulfur, and that's sulfur that's actually drawn into the plant through those little stomates, those openings in the leaf, as it draws in air, as it draws in gases. And so some of that sulfur comes into the plant through the drawing in of gases as well. Now we've worked our way through all the different plant available sources of sulfur. And we're going to move on from here into a big topic, an important topic because it explains some things, this topic of how sulfur exits the cycle. How do we lose it from the soil sulfur cycle? And so next time, we're going to venture into exiting. We're going to talk about leaching at that point. And for now, we thank you very much for watching, and we look forward to visiting with you more on Burris Agronomy U.